Hi, everyone. My name is Brinke, and this is actually the third time I'll be speaking at dotnet Amsterdam, so it's really fun to be here. I think the first time it was somewhere like near the canal, still in the old office, and then the second time was at Global Azure, I think last year near the Dam, and now it's in this really cool building of JetBrains. So I really like the locations they're providing here. So I spoke about .NET configuration secret management in the past. I also spoke about data API builder in the past, but today we're going to talk about something completely else. So I want to talk about OpenAPI and everything that changed since .NET 9, because that is a standard release. It's not LTS. .NET 10 will be LTS, but there's a lot of changes coming in the way that we use OpenAPI and the way that you interact with it and everything. One little note is I gave this talk a few weeks ago as well at BitBash, and that was really fun. I'm also just looking for feedback. These are like user groups. I really like looking for feedback here. So if you're like, hey, these parts of your presentation could be improved or something like that, please let me know. All feedback is welcome. So with all of that being said, let's get started. Okay. Like I said, my name is Brinke. I'm a senior software engineer and a knowledge officer at Arcady. We are a Dutch consultancy company based in Zwolle. And I do, as a consultant, I do a whole lot of things, mostly with .NET and Azure. But as you can see, I also do a whole lot of things with app development. I've done that in the past, DevOps and front end and that kind of stuff. I'm also a Microsoft MVP, so I like blogging, I like speaking, podcasting, doing a lot of open source in my free time. If you want to learn more about me, you can scan these links. You'll also find them at the end. So then what are we actually going to talk about today? So I want to talk about a little refresher on OpenAPI for people that might need one of those. Then I want to talk about OpenAPI and .NET 9, do a couple demos as well. And then we're going to talk about the future of OpenAPI and .NET. And finally, we're going to have some conclusions, some resources, some questions, etc. And I always like making these kind of sessions interactive. So if you have any questions throughout, or you have any thoughts to share, some cool experiences, please do. Let's make this nice and interactive. So yeah, just so you know. Okay, is there anyone here who would like a little refresher on OpenAPI? Awesome, great, cool. I always think it's worth asking. So yeah, let's talk about what OpenAPI is. Let's talk about why you should use it and the kind of things you might be familiar with here. Okay, hands up. Who said that they didn't really know OpenAPI, but does know that UI on the right? Yeah, there you go. Someone already said it, Swagger. So one fun thing is whenever I talk to people about OpenAPI, some people are like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Sounds cool. And then I say the word Swagger, and then they immediately understand what I'm talking about. So as you'll see in a slide or two, so it used to be called Swagger, and now it's nowadays, since like 2015 or something, it's called OpenAPI. But enough about its history for now. Let's talk about what it is, right? So OpenAPI is a standard for designing, building, and documenting your APIs. API building can be quite complex, right? We usually just think, we just send some data somewhere, we get data back. But there's things like the HTTP methods, right? There's your request body, your response body. There's all these different status codes. There's the paths, there's the headers and authentication. There's a lot of things going on in a complicated API, or even in a simple one. There can be a whole lot of things going on. The problem as well is, for example, I like writing my APIs with ASP.NET Core. But if I was working in like a multifunctional team, multi-languages team, or kind of an entire group teams, some people might use Ruby, some people might use Python, some people might use Next.js, Node, that kind of stuff. So then if I were to describe an API, or if I were to look at code from a different framework, I might not understand it. So with OpenAPI, you have basically a text format, a standard, a spec, that basically explains everything that an API does. So looking at this document and knowing how an OpenAPI document works, you will understand in any language how you would implement it and what you would expect from it. And that's also the fun thing about it. So OpenAPI, that's the spec on the right. That's actually input for Swagger UI. So loads of people think, that's that entire Swagger OpenAPI thing. That's just that thing on the right. You can do a whole lot of different things with it. Cool thing with OpenAPI is that it works with loads of technologies, right? It's not limited to .NET. You can basically find OpenAPI tools in any language or framework. And then you might be like, so why would I want to use this, right? So there's loads of tooling. We already looked at Swagger UI, but there's things like API client generators. There's documentation that you can automatically generate based on your API. There's mock servers, which are really, really fun. imagine the scenario where you're building a front-end feature, but the API is not done. So you're just gonna write yourself a little bit of fake code and etc. And then the API is done, and then you have to change your entire front end because the bodies look different, or you're gonna have to kind of make things fit in a new API flow. With a mock server, you can basically give as an input an OpenAPI document, and your server will run like a fake server based on that API. So if you talk to your API designer and you're like, hey, please, give me an OpenAPI document on what the API will look like at some point, and then you can just program against that fake mock server with like example data and fake data. Really, really fun. Don't see people doing that a lot, but it's a really, really interesting approach. There's also API testing with Postman and other tools, or even vulnerability testing tools. If you're interested in more, because you should learn a whole lot of these tools because it's really, really fun and easy to use because most people are already using OpenAPI by default, take a look at openapi.tools. And if you want to learn more about, in my opinion, the most powerful feature around OpenAPI, it's API client generation. And you can scan that QR code on the right. It'll bring you to my blog post to learn more about it. And you'll also find it at the end in a few slides. So I see one person scanning it there, so I'll wait a second. Thank you. Okay. So that's a couple tooling. So just with one of those specs that you can add, for example, with .NET, you just use packages, right? And then you get loads of tooling available to you. Okay. So what does the history look like? So in 2011, we got Swagger 1, right? And then in 2014, we got Swagger 2. 2015, they were like, hey, we're onto something here. And they kind of donated it, and it became its own thing. So it became the OpenAPI initiative. In 2017, OpenAPI version 3 came out. It's the one that's basically the industry is most familiar with. 2021 released OpenAPI 3.1. Even though it's a minor increase, it's actually a pretty breaking change. They became like kind of more JSON schema compliant. So some things are quite different. Therefore, 2017's version, so version 3, is the most popular. And that's also why we're going to talk about that one today. And finally, well, last year I also gave this talk at some places, and I was like, yeah, at the end of 2024, we're going to get OpenAPI v4. It's going to be awesome. It's going to be completely, with thought in mind with LLMs and AI. And we're in March, and it's still not come out. So I'm hoping it comes out soon, but I've not really heard anything about it. But that is going to be also, something you're going to have to learn if you learn about OpenAPI now. OpenAPI v4 might, be really, really cool with this new LLM approach and making machines understand it better. Loads of cool things coming up. So let's talk a little bit about one of those specifications then. This has been the theory. Let's dive into a little bit of, code, I would say. So there's an OpenAPI specification is split into different kind of parts, right? So we have, let me switch to this one. That's better. We have information, just some metadata, like with servers and external docs. There's a security aspect as well, where you can define how your API is secured. The paths is basically the meat and potatoes, right? So these are the, your paths, like your endpoints, and that will also then use the components in which the request bodies and stuff are stored. So let's talk a little bit more about them. Let's take a look at metadata from an OpenAPI document. And in this entire presentation, I'm going to kind of keep using an example like this. So it's going to be a conference API. So here we have OpenAPI version 3. The information has a title. It's a conference API. There's a description. It's an API for managing conference talks. There's going to be some contact information, very useful, especially in internal big companies with loads of teams. Put a bit of contact information there so people can contact each other easier. Right, so there's some contact information about who owns or authorized or manages this API. So version, so it's the version of the document. It doesn't necessarily need to mean API versioning, though you can do that. External docs, if you want to have some Confluence documentation, like handwritten or something. And finally, for example, some servers, right? So we can have a list of servers that our API is running on, like local, test, production, also really useful. Right, so just a little bit of metadata about an API that we're contacting. Then there's paths. So paths are things like /talks, and this is going to be a get endpoint, and it has a tags array. So this is basically a way to group endpoints together. And this is a summary. So a summary would be, if you go to HTTP get /talks, you would get a list of talks. An operation ID is basically the unique identifier of that endpoint. If you want good OpenAPI specs, I recommend that you always add one of those to each endpoint. And then there's going to be the responses, which we're going to talk about next. You can also create a new talk. You can also create a new talk. You can do a post to /talks, and this will create a new talk. And of course, you'll need to give a request body for that one. Excuse me. So that's going to look like this. So this is, there's we see something new. So we see a request body, and this request body is required. And the content type is going to be application JSON. We could also make this a list if you want to create an API that is, for example, accepting both XML and JSON. This has a schema reference to component schemas talk. That might look really weird if you're unfamiliar with it. Basically, it kind of allows you to link to where the actual definition is stored. So here we have a schema called talk. We're going to look at that in the next slide or two, I believe. But this is basically, the object that says it has an ID, a title, a speaker name, a date, a location, that kind of stuff. There's also responses. This can be a list of responses. So we can have a 201 created, and maybe it will also return, maybe it will return the JSON as well. So it might return the same JSON as the input model. Just a simple example. So you could also return different status codes, right? We could have a 201, but it would make sense for us to have like a 400 if the request is invalid. Maybe a 409 if there's a conflict, stuff like that. Then there's parameters, right? So we can have a path /talk/ID. This is a get. So now we can get a specific talk by ID. This is also going to have a parameter. So the name is ID, which is in the path. It is required. And the schema is of type integer. Right? And looking at it like that, we have an entire API, kind of already thinking in your head, how would I write this in my favorite language, my favorite framework of choice? And then there's the components. So components are basically everything that's reusable. And basically everything can be a component. And we store everything, like the schema is always in there. So you have like the top of the document, which is like the endpoints, and the bottom, which are like the components. So you kind of have a nice separation of your, your endpoints and your models. So here we have a talk. This is of type object with properties, ID, title, speaker, and time, which is going to be type string in format datetime. Might look weird because we're returning JSON here. JSON doesn't have its own type for dates, so we're returning like an ISO 8601 string, I believe. Any questions about this so far? Yeah.
Oh, sorry. So my question is, you're showing all of this, and this is important. Don't get me wrong, but are you writing any of this by hand?
The intern is. I'm not. No. So so there's a really valid question. So am I writing this by hand? I generally don't. So there's OpenAPI purists and there's me. So in certain languages and certain tools and several frameworks, people prefer to write this by hand, view this as the source of truth, show it to other people. In .NET, it's most normal to have an application, and then a document like this is generated out of it. That is great. But then, of course, you also need to make sure that the document that's generated is going to be completely valid. I prefer to do it that way because having to write this document by hand and then implement the API following exactly what this document is saying may lead to issues. And I don't want to have any synchronization issues in it. But both approaches are valid. But it's just easier in .NET land to do what we're going to do in a bit by generating this thing automatically. Yeah. Getting a workout today, Eric.
Yeah. One of your first slides was about different versions, starting with Swagger.
Right.
And with the improvements of OpenAI support, how does Microsoft address the challenges of maintaining backwards compatibility in versioning large-scale APIs, especially in microservices architectures?
Right. So how do you, if I understand you correctly, how do you do versioning with an OpenAPI document?
Yeah.
Right. I don't have this in a demo right now, but I can link you to something later. So what you can do is when you use, I believe on top of my head, it's ASP.versioning. I think it's the official library from Microsoft or from the community backed by Microsoft. And that allows you to add multiple versions, and that will hook into OpenAPI documents. So you can go to localhost /OpenAPI /version1.json /version2.json and then have different documents per version. There's multiple strategies, but that's the easiest one. So that any breaking change, you can just find a different document. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Any more for now?
Can we do it later? Or?
We can do, if you think it's then we can do it later. We'll do it later. Awesome. Okay. So let's continue. So let's talk about what we came here for. OpenAPI in .NET 9. So yeah, who is already using .NET 9 here? Who's already using .NET 10 Preview 1? Wow. Okay. Very good. Very good. All right. We're also going to talk a little bit about that later. So previously in .NET Land, there's basically the ASP.NET Core bit, and there's third-party libraries. So let's take a look at how OpenAPI used to work, or works in the current LTS. So there's basically ASP.NET Core application starts. It has like an API Explorer module, and this collects kind of the metadata and understands how your application routes are laid out. And then third-party libraries, most famous Swashbuckle, ASP.NET Core, but my favorite is NSWAG. They then collect that metadata and then create an OpenAPI document. So ASP.NET Core doesn't really have any knowledge on what OpenAPI really is. The same thing goes for when you're requesting an OpenAPI document. It actually is all handled by third-party libraries. And the same thing for like if you want to go to Swagger UI, it's all done by third-party libraries. Yeah. So there used to be a very fancy transition here, but not anymore. I'm sorry. Okay. So what does this now look like in .NET 9? So as you can see, the amount of work done by third-party libraries has shrunk a whole lot, right? It's now basically Swagger UI. So what happened is that Microsoft was kind of looking at like what does the OpenAPI landscape look like today for .NET developers, and they saw a couple of issues. The first issue was that Swashbuckle ASP.NET Core, which comes bundled with all the default new .NET projects, was unmaintained for like 4 years. Like there were like 20 or like I don't know, even so many pull requests. Let's keep it at that. There were lots of open pull requests, open issues, and the developer, he was also honest. Like he said, he had a kid recently. He didn't have time anymore. So that was a bit of an issue where Microsoft was like, okay, we're shipping this library that's basically unmaintained. There are security issues in specific ways of configuring Swagger UI, and also there's a problem where there's basically a bit of a mismatch between ASP.NET Core and OpenAPI. So the way that the routes are collected by the API Explorer don't necessarily match one-to-one to OpenAPI documents. So there was always a little bit of friction between I want an OpenAPI document and then how that is collected. So the community and Microsoft. So Microsoft saw a bit of a problem there, and they decided, let's make our own ASP.NET Core OpenAPI library so we can kind of fix these issues with it. We can kind of create a little bit more ownership, make sure that we're shipping provided and supported solutions to our customers. So what is now happening is you can now simply in .NET 8 or even in .NET 9, you can install Microsoft ASP.NET Core OpenAPI as a package, and this will change a lot, right? So now the OpenAPI transformers, where you can kind of tweak OpenAPI settings and creating the OpenAPI document, is all done by ASP.NET Core itself. OpenAPI documents are retrieved as well. The one thing that is different is that Swagger UI, you will still need third-party libraries for. In fact, if you create a new library, a new project in .NET 9, you're not going to get Swagger UI anymore. We're going to talk a little bit about that later. And one thing that is now a little bit more officially supported, or at least a little bit more above water, I would say, is that you can now build your application and at build time generate an OpenAPI document, which can also really enable some interesting flows. And the way that works is also really funny. Okay, so why does Microsoft do this? Now, for the reasons I mentioned, but like, is there another good reason to ship your own library? Yes. So now Microsoft, since I believe .NET 7 is AOT compatible, and they want to make everything AOT compatible as fast as can. So like, the most popular stack with minimal APIs, which is new and AOT compatible, EF Core, which is kind of AOT compatible, but also OpenAPI. That also needs to become AOT compatible. Is there anyone here that would kind of like some more information about what AOT is? Yeah, awesome. Okay, so in .NET Land, in the past, if in the most popular ways of using it, you have just-in-time compilation. So just-in-time compilation means we have our C# code. When we build it, it actually gets compiled to the common intermediate language, and then at runtime on a specific machine like Mac, Linux, or Windows, then it gets compiled to the machine code. So that means that we can compile once on Windows and then run it on any OS. Kind of, the idea from Java that we stole. And it works great. But there are a couple of problems. Because, for example, the Apple platform does not allow JIT because compiling at runtime is a little bit dangerous for them. And there's also issues with memory because you need more memory to manage a JIT runtime. Your application kind of need to warm up before they actually start to run. So for applications that need to start really quick, it's not really valid. And especially in nowadays landscape with microservices and quickly killing a service and starting it back up, you want these things to be fast. And that means that you want to look into ahead of time support. So what this means is that we have our C# code, and then we build it immediately for a specific OS into native code and then run it. So now when our application starts up, it immediately starts up. There's no JIT that needs to warm up. There's nothing that needs to kind of collect some RAM and kind of things. So this is going to make sure that your application starts up a lot faster. This is going to ship you smaller binaries and containers, and it's also going to decrease your memory usage. There are also downsides. So reflection is very problematic for ahead of time compilation, where reflection at runtime, you can create types, you can inspect all these kind of types in your application. But because there is no runtime, there is also no real guarantee that it understands all of those types. And it will also have to remove all the code that is not necessary for AOT. So if you're going to say, give me some information about this type, at runtime, the compiler doesn't know that it might have had to compile that type into the binary, and it's going to throw really weird exceptions because it has no idea what that type is. It sounds really complicated, but Microsoft made it very easy. If you're going to use AOT, you're going to get loads of warnings when you're using packages or code that is not AOT compatible, but it's something to look out for. The biggest thing that we're losing if we're going to use AOT is controllers. Is anyone, so can I get a hands here who are using controllers? And who is using minimal API only? Yeah, see 3-4 hands. There we go. See, so that's I think 80-90% are using controllers here, and only 2 people for minimal APIs. So this is going to impact you because you have to migrate away from controllers. Controllers are really old and they're built with reflection. There's nothing wrong with them, right? It's just that minimal APIs will be a little bit more performant and AOT compatible. We're going to take a little look at an AOT compatible application in regards to OpenAPI in a bit as well, so you can get a feeling for it. But one more breaking change is that Swagger UI is not included by default. So Microsoft was looking at this and they were like, okay, we've decided we're going to make our own library. We're going to make our own OpenAPI library, and it's going to be great. But what are we going to do around Swagger UI? Because Swagger UI has security issues in specific authentication setups where it might leak your tokens and keys. It is also another binary that they need to manage, right? So it's a third-party thing, and they would either need to keep shipping it, or they would need to either manage it themselves, which introduces more issues with, depending on third-party stuff. And otherwise, they would need to, if they ship it completely themselves, they would need to ship web assets in their API projects, which also sounds a bit weird. All in all, they decided, let's not ship this, and let's see what the community does. And one real fun thing that the community does is always improve on things. And nowadays, you can see that Scalar is kind of the new Swagger UI. It's the new kid on the block. Loads of cool features. We're going to look at it later. That is kind of getting more and more popular. And I would actually recommend that over Swagger UI nowadays. And it's really easy, actually, to add Swagger UI back. The same thing for Scalar. You need one package, one line of code. But it is something you would need to do yourself. The next thing is that XML comments are currently not supported in .NET9. So you can, if you have an endpoint here, like get talks, you can create XML comments like a summary. This endpoint returns a list of talks. There's an order by parameter, that kind of stuff. This automatically translated into OpenAPI documents in .NET 8. But with Microsoft Library in .NET 9, this is no longer the case. So what do? If you want to be really cool, you can install some really freaky early package from Microsoft in some weird NuGet store where you can get this back. I wouldn't do it. You can, if you really want it back for schemas, Martin Costello, who also works on Swashbuckle and basically anytime you look at a .NET project, Martin Costello is there. It's really weird, but he does everything. And he also created his own OpenAPI extension package where you can get XML comments back for schemas. In .NET 10, this will be supported again. So if you just wait until like November, half a year, this will be supported out of the box. You can work around this. We're going to talk about it in a while, but I think it's a shame that this wasn't shipped in .NET 9, but it's on its way. Okay, let's do a little demo. I'm going to quickly duplicate my screen and see if this keeps working. Okay. Is this readable for people in the back, or should I make it a tad bigger? I see a little bit of a I see one thumbs and one I need a bit more information, boys. Okay, bad. I saw a bad. Okay, we're making it bigger. Is this better? Okay, you need glasses, man. All right, well, this, but not bigger. Awesome. Okay, so I have a little code tour set up where we can kind of go through .NET 8 and OpenAPI and compare that to .NET 9 with controllers, minimal APIs, ahead of time compilation, and that kind of stuff. And then we're going to go back to the slides. So this is basically, a CS project for .NET 8. If you created a new web API, you would get this package reference, swashbuckle, ASP.NET Core, and that's it. That's all you need for OpenAPI in .NET 8. If we go to the program CS, you can see we're adding, let me put my mouse somewhere that it is not annoying. We can add endpoints API Explorer. There's a Swagger generation happening. You always have to write these 3 annoying lines of code to get XML comments to work. And then we build the application and we call use Swagger UI. So if you go to /Swagger, you get the UI. If you go to /Swagger /v1.json on top of my head, then you get the OpenAPI document. So just these lines of code, and it will understand everything around OpenAPI. So let's create a little application here. So I've created this talk model. It has an integer identifier, ID. There's a title with a min length and a max length, which you can use for validation in ASP.NET Core, but also to enrich your OpenAPI documents to kind of add some constraints. There's a length in minutes between 1 and 640. There's a room name, and this is a description, the name of the room where the talk will take place. As you can see, I didn't use XML comments here because it's not supported in the .NET 9. So I used a description instead. So that's kind of a workaround for it. We also have a create talk model, which is very similar with a title, a length in minutes, and a room name. Right. So this is going to basically all of the APIs I'm showing you are going to implement these models. So let me make this a bit smaller. So here's a talks controller in .NET 8. So it's an API controller, and let me put my mouse here. It has an HTTP GET. It produces a response type, an I-read-only collection with talk models with a status code of 200 OK. So this is telling the metadata from ASP.NET Core that your endpoint is going to return that list of talks if the status code is 200 OK. And I also added a producer's default response type, which I think is very useful. Basically tells OpenAPI, hey, if there's anything returned here that is not documented, like this endpoint randomly returns a 503, it will always be of type problem details, because that's the default problem reporting tool in ASP.NET Core. This kind of thing with producer's default response type with like nswag for API client generation really increases the quality. So I always recommend that people turn this on or make it a global thing if you don't want to type it at every endpoint. And now you can see that I double define this here. You don't have to do this. You can also do it like this, and it will say the same thing. And I'm returning a list of talks. We can also get a specific talk, right? So we can go ahead and say, well, I want to get a specific talk by ID. So now this endpoint is going to return a talk model with status code 200, or it's going to return 404 not found. And one interesting thing is that you can enable, we're going to talk about that in the final bit of slides as well, but I kind of want to show it to you already, is what you can do is if you enable the include OpenAPI analyzers in your CS proj, it will actually analyze if your API is correct. And now you'll actually see that we get a warning that says, hey, your method returns an undeclared status code. That's very, very good, because it is very easy over time to get APIs that evolve, and then kind of some undeclared status code sneaks in there. And to me, maybe I'm talking a little bit, perfectionistic here, But if an API like even declares one or two little changes that are, returns a status code or a body that is not set up in your OpenAPI document, I don't trust you anymore. Like, we have trust issues. I've worked in this quite often where I generate an API client based on a company's OpenAPI document, and then I get loads of errors at runtime. It really, really irks me. So I always want to tell people, please make sure that your documents are correct and check them. And this helps you a lot in controllers. Now we could also create a talk. So we could create.
I had a question about your
Yeah.
previous one.
Sorry, I didn't see you there.
No worries. So can you
I'll scroll up a bit. Yeah, thank you.
So you define the min value of your ID here in the get statement instead of as a min value on the.
Yeah.
property.
That's true.
Is that deliberately or?
It depends on what you want. There's a good question here. So the question is like, why do I choose to define it here instead of like here as validation? So I guess it's just a little, how do you say that? A little bit of automation. That's just kind of what I always do. So I always just put it here. That means that if I were to go to /talk/-3, it would just return a 404 because the endpoint doesn't exist. You could also do it here, and then it would be part of validation and the OpenAPI document. Maybe it actually is better to put it here. Yeah. But for the rest, it's just because I didn't really think about it. What is your preference?
I think I prefer the data annotations.
Yeah, like over here. So like the range.
The more complex bodies will be annotated with that. And
yeah.
Also response models.
Some big number here.
And
there
I think also from a user perspective, if I send for some strange reason a 0 over -1 and I get a 404.
Yeah.
I think I would be, unsurprisingly surprised.
Yeah, I get that. I think I might change that. That's a really good. That's a good point of feedback. Thank you. Great. So I'm in this endpoint as well. We're going to just create a talk. It's going to be a post.
Sorry.
Sorry. I didn't see you as well. I'm so sorry.
I just had a question. Are you able to configure those alerts to become actual errors?
Definitely.
To avoid situations like you just described where there's a mismatch. You definitely don't want that being published.
Right. You want that as an error. Yeah, 100%. So it's very simple to do that. This is what I always recommend everyone turn on into their projects. It's basically warnings. Someone help me out. Someone knows this. Thank you. Warning as error. And I think I think you might need to put this to true or enabled.
Yeah, but then it's global, right?
Yeah, this is global.
You cannot set it just specifically for the analyzing results of the OpenAPI.
You can do that. So if you want to, you can say here, treat warning as error or something, or treat warnings as error, and then put this specific code in there. So if we were to take a look at what that code is, we will see that this is this one. So if we were to now put this in the warnings as errors, it would only make this an error.
Yeah, correct. Thanks.
I see you in the back.
Yes. What about .editor config? I think it's the best place for such errors and warnings.
Sorry, I didn't fully get that.
Can you hear me? Oh, no, sorry. What about .editor config? I
Editor
think it's
config.
the way better place to put and configure warnings and errors
Right. So
than in approach level.
If I understand you correctly, your question is like, why not put these things in the editor config?
Yes.
Right. Okay. So the editor config is not really meant as a place to. Can you do that? Can you put in the editor config your alerts and your warnings?
Yes, that's how usually we manage them.
Oh, really? Yeah, I do sometimes do that for styling, but I never really did that like consciously for errors. Oh, yeah, that might be true. Yeah, that's it. That's right. So it is a mess. I still want to make an entire talk about formatting in .NET because it is a mess.
We usually enable it on a project level. We set analyzers to the maximum level and then just disable some rules using the .editor config.
Yeah, that could also work, definitely. I just always enable any error, any warning as error, but whatever someone wants. But thank you. That's a good point. Okay, so we're going to continue now to keep the pace going. Any more questions we'll do a little bit later. So we can also create a talk, and like we already said, this can create a 200 OK. This could return a bad request, or this could return a conflict. And well, the specific code is not all that interesting. So let's take a little look at the OpenAPI document that's generated. This is like sticky scroll, so you can kind of still see what's going on here at the top. So here we have the path APIs with talks, get responses 200. So this is the first response for getting a list of talks. The description is okay. There's the content type is text plain, which is one of those things from Swashbuckle. And this is going to return an array of talk models. You can also get a specific talk by ID, and this is also going to return 200, but it's also going to return default. So this is going to tell it like, hey, any undocumented response codes will be of type problem details. We can also create a new talk. You can see that this is the summary, creates a talk. This is also what we saw in like the description and in the XML comments and that kind of stuff. So we can create a talk. There's problem details here. Anyone here unfamiliar with problem details? I see around 1, 2 hands, 3 hands. So problem, there's basically a bit of a problem in the industry where everyone likes to define their own API errors, which is fine. There's nothing really wrong with it. But there is an industry standard one, which is called problem details. And the .NET implements this by default. So it's you can see this more and more often where there's just one specific kind of body for a generic error. And that just makes error handling for multiple APIs and multiple companies easier. So this is going to have properties like the type, which is like some XML namespace on top of my head. This is always just done by .NET. I don't think about this. There's a title that you can set up yourself, the status code, detail, which can be like, a little description, an instance. And if you want, you can even add your own custom properties, right? Maybe like some language code, or maybe the tenant or the user ID, that kind of stuff. Then there's the talk model we talked about before. So here we can see that this is going to be where Swashbuckle makes a mistake. It says that the ID, the length in minutes, the room name, and the title are required. And it has properties, which is the ID. It has a title. And it says that the title is nullable, which is weird because I marked it as a public required string. So this is where Swashbuckle makes a little mistake, which NSWAG and Microsoft's own library will fix. But you can also see here that the min length and the max length are actually respected based on those attributes. Same with the length in minutes, the room name, that kind of stuff. Yeah. Yeah, you can, and that is what Swashbuckle wants you to do. But yeah, I don't like to do that, because what you can do to fix this is add a required attribute here. And then it will understand that this is no longer nullable. But there's a word right there that says the same thing. Swashbuckle should listen to me. It's already required. But yeah, it used to make sense. That is, it used to be really good default behavior because we didn't have a required keyword. But this also, Swashbuckle hasn't really been all that much maintained. So it's just kind of legacy stuff. But this is one of the reasons why I tell people don't use Swashbuckle. I don't want to have to add required keywords everywhere. Again, because if you forget, you get really weird nullable errors in your API clients. Yeah, and in and in NSWAG, which is the competitor. Let's have a look. Okay. Yeah. Right, yeah, like based on the question, like based on, does it get the nullability thing straight out of the code, like string question mark in question? Yes. Yeah. Okay, so. Yeah, then it is useful. So if you use data annotations and then want to check if stuff is required, it's useful. But I'm pretty sure that .NET 8 and 9, even without the required keyword, will still understand that the required keyword must mean that it's thing. So it's kind of died out. Just for this kind of stuff, it is useful and stuff like that, I think. Okay, so here's like the Swagger document, right, where we can have a list of talks that is automatically generated. So it's telling you, it's telling us that, hey, there's you're gonna get this response body back. I'll zoom in a second. I used to have zoom it on, but currently I don't. So we're gonna get an ID, a title, length in minutes, and a room name. Gonna execute this. You can see there's a talk about OpenAPI, Dapper, GenAI, managed identities, Q Sharp, that's Quantum Sharp, that kind of stuff. Right. Let's continue. Let's make a little bit more pace. So in .NET 9, what has changed? So this is the interesting stuff. So in .NET 9, you can see that we're using that here. We're going to now grab Microsoft ASP.NET Core OpenAPI. And when you do .NET New Web API and you tell it, do it in the framework of .NET 9, this one is included by default. Let me enable word wrap. Here we go. And I installed Scalar ASP.NET Core by myself as a replacement for Swagger UI. And now, how do you wire this up? This must be extremely complicated, right? So you call add OpenAPI, and then you call add map OpenAPI, and then you call add map Scalar API reference, and you're done. So it is basically the exact same thing as even easier. I'm really curious what they're going to do with the XML comments. I hope that you don't have to do that yourself anymore in .NET 10. But this is basically the same experience as you're used to. And you'll find that very similar experience when using Microsoft's package versus NSwag or Swashbuckle. So Microsoft worked together a lot with the community from Swashbuckle and NSwag to design their API. So there's going to be the same kind of concepts. Things are going to be called a little differently. But if you're very familiar with OpenAPI and setting that kind of stuff up, it will be very easy to transition to Microsoft's version. A little difference here, for example, is that we're not using XML comments at the moment. So here we're using endpoint summary and HTTP post with a name to set the operation ID, that kind of stuff. We're gonna what are the benefits? So by default, we get a servers array filled for us with the server of localhost. It's a little nice benefit, I guess. You're gonna see that it's actually telling us like the title is no longer nullable because it wasn't. So now that's fixed, which is really very nice. And the same thing for minimal APIs. So minimal APIs in .NET 9. It's the same setup for the program CS, but there are a couple changes. Let me finish the sentence and then I'll get to you. So for setting up minimal APIs in .NET 9, you could have like a group API/talks. We could have an endpoint that goes to / to get the talks. You could have an endpoint that goes to get a specific ID to get a specific talk or create a talk. And well, this is very similar to the approach before. Here we have with summary. This creates a talk. This doesn't work with word wrap. Word wrap. There you go. Yeah.
I just want to mention a little gotcha that I hit setting this up.
Please.
With .NET Aspire. If you are using the reverse proxy,
right,
that servers array has your internal ports.
Right. That's really interesting.
And that breaks Scalar because of cores.
Yeah, that makes it's using the OpenAPI document. That's interesting.
Yeah.
So
you need to manually either turn off the reverse proxy for local debugging. That's fine. Or figure out a way to set the server's URL correctly.
Has someone already gotten angry enough to make a GitHub issue about it?
They did, and the response was turn off the reverse proxy.
Really?
Yep.
Okay. Who wants to get angry with me and fix this? All right, but that's a really good point. I was gonna actually use some Aspire stuff next week. I would have probably ran into this. Thank you so much for attending tonight. You saved me probably a few hours. All right. So here we use with minimal APIs, we can use typed results to, for example, basically tell the API Explorer what minimal API is doing. So here we're going to say we're going to return a list of OK with a list of talk models. And here we're going to use a union type kind of thing, at least that's how they describe it, where we kind of return either OK talk model or not found. And then you can see we're using typed results here. And this is basically kind of return almost the same response as you did with controllers. The one thing that this doesn't happen out of the box is that you get problem details, correct? Like out of the box with minimal APIs. Maybe we're going to get that. I'm going to talk to them about that. And then there's a lot more stuff, but around creating a talk minimal API. But it's basically the same that we've already seen before. All right. Okay. Ahead of time compilation. This is cool. This is cool stuff. And with cool, I mean cool, but also quite annoying sometimes. Publish AOT. Set that to true. So what you can do to get this is you can call .NET new web API AOT ahead of time, and then it will generate like a little application for you with some to-do stuff, etc. But that's like a good getting started point. So what this does for you is it says publish AOT to true, and this will enable loads of analyzers to tell you like, hey, you're doing things here that's not going to work at runtime or it's not guaranteed to work. Again, we're still using Swashbuckle. Again, we're still using that kind of, we're still using, no, not Swashbuckle. We're using Microsoft's OpenAPI library and Scalar. So we're getting a Slim builder here instead of the default builder. So Slim builder removes loads of stuff for performance reasons and because it might use reflection, which is not supported. If I were to build this, excuse me. No, there it is. So here we see a little yellow line that's telling us, hey, you're using get types, but get types is decorated with requires unreferenced code attributes, and this can break functionality when trimming application code. And this will be fine. It will understand this when you run this. But for example, when you're using like open generic types or infinite generic types, which some libraries use, it will just randomly break at runtime. So this is very interesting, and this is also another reason to put warnings as errors, because you don't want to run into this at runtime. Another change is that JSON serialization, deserialization, always works with reflection, which is not supported. So now that we have source generators since a couple of years, you want to set it up so it actually generates C# code to serialize and deserialize types for you, which is also tons more performance. So we're going to set that up here with some type info resolvers. We're going to use the same code as before with setting up OpenAPI. And this is going to be kind of stupid, but I'm curious what you guys think of this. So it still needs to know what types do I need to generate C# code for to serialize and deserialize types. So here you need to list all of your types in your assembly. And as far as I know, you need to do this by hand. So if you have a really big API, you need to list a really big list of JSON serializable attributes here, because otherwise it doesn't know what to do. But like for a small API, that's doable. But I think maybe they're gonna. I have no idea if they're gonna fix that, but hopefully. That is a really funny question. Please get angry enough to make a GitHub issue for it. That's a really good point. Okay. Oh gosh. Oh no, we're not talking about that here. No, please don't mention it. Okay. So Scalar, and then we're going to go back to my slides. I'm still quite okay on time. So Scalar here, one reason to use this, it has integrated dark mode, right? Applause is allowed. So we have integrated dark mode. I'm going to disable it because for the people in the back. So here we have like a list of all of our endpoints. Let me zoom in a little bit. It's also responsive. So here we have a list of endpoints, API/talks. We can test this request. And then we can send it. And you can see here, well, there's the endpoints. Wow, amazing. But another cool thing is you could also say like, how would I write this in jQuery? I don't know. But here you can see that it automatically would write some code for you to get started. Like for production, I would recommend API client generation processes. But for kind of playing around or kind of figuring out how to do this in Ruby or whatever language, it is really nice to have this integrated. And there's also loads of plugins and things you can use and to make Scalar even cooler. So definitely check this out. Okay, let me switch back to my slides. Here we go. Okay, before we talk about that, any questions? Yeah, I see one in the back.
It's just a quick one about the analyzer that you had for OpenAPI. Would that replace something like Spectre, the linting tool for OpenAPI documents?
Oh, will that replace something like Spectre? So I've not really used Spectre before. So I guess Spectre basically checks if your OpenAPI OpenAPI document makes sense.
Yeah, it's just like a linter for an OpenAPI JSON file, and you can extend it with lots of
with rules and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So I think it doesn't replace it. So I think what the analyzer does in .NET is make sure that your code matches your spec, and then Spectre will make sense that will check that your document, follows the organization's rules, because Spectre cannot check if your at runtime behaves differently than at OpenAPI document time.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Thanks.
But use both. Yeah, in front. Oh, nee, in de back. Nee, toch niet. Nee.
Run it. Thanks. Just a question. So you have specified quite a few preferences, like using in Swagger instead of another one.
That's what I get paid to do, yeah.
Of course. But have you checked how do your preferences compare to the preferences which, for instance, GitHub Copilot gives by default?
Ooh.
Because now what I see is that whenever you have a colleague who is, for instance, going from just writing a front end and also now writing a bit of a back end, or for Python to C#, what they do, they just have Visual Studio Code, GitHub Copilot, and just generate me this, and that's okay.
Yeah.
For a seasoned .NET developer, that's fine, but
yeah, okay. So I understand your question. So you're kind of talking about you prefer to not go against the grain of what Copilot does, because that might generate different code than what the team does, kind of like experience-wise.
Or it's more like have you you have some preferences. There are some preferences of ChatGPT or Copilot.
Right.
What are the differences?
So I would say that is kind of a dangerous hill. So where Copilot is basically trained on the most common code. So I think Copilot would write a hello world better than any of us, because that's 99% of code on the internet. Whereas something with setting something up with Spectre, like was already mentioned, or maybe something with Aspire with a reverse proxy, that kind of stuff that makes sense might not really be trained for Copilot. So I would prefer, it's Copilot, right? It's a Copilot. I would prefer that someone is allowed to write on my code base, but I guess, follow the team's rules.
Slide to compare what are the preferences.
I'm not sure if I agree, but we can talk about that later, because I would still be interested to learn more about why you think that. Any Sean and someone else in the back. But thank you. I would love to learn more.
I have to admit this isn't a question, but just remember that Copilot costs $20 a month. Would you trust a developer you paid $20 a month for?
You get paid? No, sorry. I had to do it. We all did this for fun.
One comment regarding Copilot is we tried it with OpenTelemetry, and it gave it doesn't follow conventions.
Yeah.
The results were you need to really read first, and giving it to some newbie, to somebody new to such a thing's not the best choice.
Right.
Another thing is that, but if you have existing project with already some conventions, like a way how you define your endpoints, I think Copilot will look into it and should ideally follow them. I hope. I'm not that deep into AI, but ideally, if you have a lot of controllers, for example, it should follow it. If no, then you need to push it to following.
Yeah, I do think you touched upon something interesting there, where conventions are maybe used by Copilot, but I think that the previous comment about Spectre is basically the right approach here, where you set up rules, right? You set up like, hey, this PR is not going to go merged because your code breaks our conventions. So you might have written it yourself, you might have generated with Copilot, but Copilot didn't do its job correctly. So now you're going to make sure that you're not going to merge incorrect code, where Copilot might still help you if it's trained on its conventions.
Sander, I want to set you up for the upcoming slide.
Right.
Are you also going to talk about .NET 10? And are there any differences between .NET 9 and .NET 10? Because
the number is one higher.
That's it. Because So far, for me to transition to .NET 9, actually the biggest hurdle is Swashbuckle. It's not a big hurdle, but it's just LTS on .NET 8. It's going to be fine.
Right.
Is there any point in switching to .NET 9, knowing that in .NET 10 it will actually change a lot? That's kind of my question.
So that's a really good question. I have an exact slide on all of the questions you just asked in a little bit. So we'll handle it then, and if you have more questions, let me know. Yeah? Okay. So we have an OpenAPI document based on the code that I've shown you. But what if you want to customize it, right? So you might want to customize it to perhaps set up some contact information, because that's not part of your endpoints, but you might still want that in your metadata, external docs and servers, etc. And the really funny thing is where if you return a decimal in .NET, OpenAPI makes that a double, which might mess up some API client generators. So you might want to set up a transformer to tell OpenAPI to serialize types differently. So you can do that. It's really comparable if you're used to Swashbuckle or NSWAG, just a bit of a different syntax. So we have a document transformer, an operation transformer, and a schema transformer, where the document is the entire thing. Operations are endpoints, and schemas are your models. And you can do a whole lot of things here. I think most people will use it to set up these things. Maybe if you want, you can enforce company policies here. Maybe every endpoint needs to return 418 I'm a teapot. Maybe every endpoint needs to be documented with a default. That kind of stuff is what you can do here. But it depends on your use case. If you have some good ideas of what good transformers would be for endpoints, let me know, because I'm going to build a library with really useful ones. So give me money. No. Okay. So generating OpenAPI documents at build time. I told you this was going to be funny. I find this funny. I'm curious what you think. So why would you want to do this? Well, you can generate an OpenAPI document at build time instead of opening it in your browser, going to the Swagger page, clicking on the link, and then downloading and storing it on your disk. And this can be really useful because then you can lint it in your pipeline with, I think, Spectre, you called it? Yeah. Spectral. Oh, Spectral. Yeah, no. I keep saying Spectre. I'm sorry. Spectral. Yeah, no, I've actually heard of that one because they've not heard of Spectre. Right. No, it's all good. So Spectral is really interesting with kind of validation on your API. So every endpoint needs to have API/talks instead of API/talk, that kind of stuff. You can make sure that your API is valid, and otherwise your PR doesn't get merged. But you can also do integration tests and etc. If this is part of your in your repo, you can take a look in your PRs. So how do you set this up? Must be very difficult. Not really. We install a package, Microsoft Extensions API Description Server. We build, and it's done. It is now part of your hard drive. So how does that work? What it does is it starts up. It actually does .NET Run under the hood, goes to the URL, downloads it, and stores it on your hard drive, and then stops the server. I find that very, very funny. Apparently, it's not possible at this time to analyze build ASP.NET Core assembly to understand the OpenAPI document. So they were like, okay, we're just going to replace the actual server with a mock server, but it will actually execute all of the code like the services.add OpenAPI, services add DB context, and you're going to have to work around that. And then it just starts the server, grabs the document, and then stops the server. But yeah. Right. So how do you want to work around that problem? Yeah, exactly. In the demo, in 2 slides, I'm going to talk about that. Actually, if you don't mind, I'm going to save your questions until the end because I'm running kind of short on time. Is that okay? Awesome. Okay. Okay, so I want to talk about a couple of tips that I want to leave you with. Then we do a little demo, and then there's the final resource and the agents. I might need 1 or 2 more minutes if that's okay. Okay. So how do you create a good OpenAPI document? And this is by my personal experience. So take with it what you will. But I hope some of you leave with these today, maybe apply them tomorrow, etc. Or just let me know what you think afterwards. If you're like, hey, this is bullshit, let me know. I'd love to hear it. Or if you have your own tips. So all endpoints should have their return values documented. Like I said, please, every value. Don't miss out on one, because if you are going to forget the 4.1 authorized or 403 forbidden or whatever, and then I'm going to run into it in the wild, it's going to be really annoying because then I would need to combine your OpenAPI document with custom code to kind of fill the gaps, and it's really, really annoying. You can also, of course, also have the opinion that having to write this every time is really annoying. So you could maybe use a document or an operation transformer to add this to every endpoint. You might lose out on some of that analyzer stuff, but you're probably never going to actually do authorization checks in your endpoints. So that might be a very valid approach. Same thing for minimal APIs, where you can use producer's response type. You can use the results type like we showed in the demo with the union type, or you can use extension methods. So you can do produces talk model with this status code, that kind of stuff. Make sure you do this. Also, check out if you can use summaries and descriptions for relevant endpoints. I think using this for hello world endpoints is not always that interesting. But if you're working in a very specific domain like banking, mortgages, insurance, other stuff that is complicated or might not maybe obvious to new team members or members from other teams, making sure that you actually decorate stuff like this is what this endpoint does, a little bit more of a description, makes it a lot more easy for me to understand how your API works and prevents me from having to send you annoying messages on Slack. So do this. Same thing for minimal APIs. You can use with summary, with description. You can also use those attributes again. And don't forget, you can use the XML comments for this kind of stuff in .NET 10. Or now, if you want to be very brave with a preview package. Also, each endpoint could have a unique operation ID. This doesn't really matter for specific, like I think Kyoda doesn't really care about this, but NSWAG API client generation does. So I prefer to always do this. This is one thing where I believe Microsoft kind of dropped the ball on. So NSWAG always did this by default. So it saw get talks async, and it was like, this operation ID must be talks _ get talks, because the talks is the controller, and this is the method name. But now you have to type that every endpoint. And I find that kind of annoying, because it's just busy work. But it's still important to do this for specific tools and all that kind of stuff. And this is also something you could then use Spectral to enforce. Same thing with minimal APIs. So you can use with name or endpoint name. And decorate your request and response models. You can use this for validation. If you don't, it's still useful for the OpenAPI documents. If there's a title, length, or if there's like a length and you call your properties length without actually specifying what it means, it's really annoying. But specifying at least some kind of range makes me understand what it is. Like length in minutes might be between 1 and 60. Then it's probably minutes. And it just also for tooling and validation, it's useful. Enable web API analyzers. This is only for MVC. So this is already kind of built in to minimal APIs if you use typed results, which is really, really nice. But if you're not using that and you're using controllers, just enable this in your API project, and then you get that behavior that we talked about earlier. Okay, quick demo, and then we'll finishing up. So demo 2. So this is going to be the one where we generate an OpenAPI document at build time. Word wrap, there we go. We install OpenAPI. Let me zoom in a bit more. We install this package. And now when we call .NET build, or actually .NET rebuild, because if it's already built and you call .NET build, it doesn't do anything. Then you're going to get that document in your project. You can also use OpenAPI documents directory, OpenAPI generate documents options to kind of specify some more settings if you want to, like a different file name or where it should be generated, etc. And here's the fun question about, so what if this is going to actually execute code, like a database migration or some other stuff that's running in a pipeline, and this is going to throw an error? Well, you simply have to write this very simple logical line of code. Check the assembly name, and if it is not the same as get document.insider. I have no idea why it's called this, but this basically just performs the check, like, hey, are we running the general OpenAPI spec at build time? So you can add documents here, like you can add rules here, like database calls, maybe some Azure Key Vault stuff. This will then not get generated when you're generating an OpenAPI spec. That's already shown. Here's some more customization. So here we have add OpenAPI, and we can add loads of different things. So we can change the OpenAPI version. We can add documents transformers that like add contact information. We can also use generics or just call the constructors. And then we can do things like every operation, so transform async, every operation has a 500 server code, for example. So you don't have to do that yourself if this is your standard. And you can change the way that certain types are generated. Okay, let me switch back. There we go. Okay, the last couple slides. Okay, so there was already a question. So what does the future look like? What is going to happen in .NET? What's going to be the difference? So my pull requests, sorry, I have to say it. So in .NET, for .NET 10, I've been merging and working quite hard on some cool features. One of the things that has recently been released in .NET 10 Preview 1 is where that produces response type that we talked about earlier is going to now have a new parameter called description. So now you can say this endpoint returns a list of talks with the status code 200, and this is because, or this is extra information you need to know about this specific response. Very useful if you're returning like a 409 conflict and you want the client to understand more about why and when this error can be happening. This was possible with really weird XML comments, but my approach is a lot easier, and it can also work for minimal APIs. There's also going to come loads of other fun stuff. You can check the GitHub page if you're interested, or I can tell you more about it later. XML comment support will be coming in .NET 10. It has already been merged, basically, so it's all done. OpenAPI version 3.1 support is coming. It is actually going to be the default in .NET 10, something I don't really agree with because it's not the most popular version, but I do understand that they don't want to rely on like 8-year-old standards. So it's a bit of a choice you have to make. Better build time generation. They're going to look into at least putting the code into the OpenAPI package and not on the other package that we're using now. And finally, we're going to be able to attach transformers to an endpoint directly instead of doing it globally. I complained about that because I found it really annoying if you want a little bit transformation for one endpoint. So now we're going to be able to do that per endpoint. There's going to be YAML support, yelling at my laptop. And then there's going to be some bug fixes as well. Should you migrate? So to me, Microsoft's package is new, right? It has AOT support. And of course, it will be very much more aligned with the philosophy from ASP.NET Core and the members that build it. So are you starting with like a new project and do you not have a lot of OpenAPI demands like XML comments and all that kind of stuff? I would say give it a try. Are you like, yeah, I do have a lot of OpenAPI demands, but I also demand AOT support? This is going to be your only option. So you have to use the .NET 9 version. And otherwise, it depends. I would always tell people migrate away from Swashbuckle and use NSWAG at least, because it just has way better defaults and better API client generation tools. But then the question becomes NSWAG or OpenAPI, and both are valid. NSWAG is not going to go away. They're still developing it. It's going to live alongside, at least for a very long time. And to me, if everything works fine for you, and there's no real benefit, there's a little bit of performance increase if you switch to Microsoft's version, just keep running NSWAG, I would say, because it just works. This is not the most amazing, high-tech piece of tech or something you're going to be using. So what is the benefit of migrating? To me, not all that much. But if you want to use AOT, definitely migrate. So .NET 9 contains lots of changes for OpenAPI. AOT support is one of the biggest changes, next to Microsoft shipping their own OpenAPI library, which changes the way you set up OpenAPI in .NET projects. By decorating your API endpoints royally with OpenAPI metadata, you'll make your API easier to use, so try to do this as much as possible. If you want, you can take a picture of some tools and some links. If you want, on the top right, you can scan to find my blog post about OpenAPI and API client generation, which, if this is kind of an introduction, might be a really, really good post to read. So you can improve the way you're using your clients. And if you want the demo of everything I've shown you today, you can find on my GitHub page. I'd like to apologize for being 3 minutes late, especially to the next speaker. Sorry. Again, I would love to, if we can still do some questions. Otherwise, we'll do it in the break. If you have some more feedback from me, let me know. One final thing is I always bring tons of stickers to an event. I'll put them on the tables in a little bit. So if you like laptop stickers, take a look at what I have brought. And thank you.